On October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba photographed a Soviet Union missile base with medium-range nuclear missiles. These missiles had the capability to hit any major city on the eastern seaboard and jeopardize the entire nation's security. Shortly after the base was detected, President John F. Kennedy was alerted and called together a group of advisors to deal with the issue. These events came in the wake of increasing Soviet hostility during the Cold War and represent the closest the Cold War ever came to igniting. The Cold War was the result of the dissolving alliances that were made in World War II between the United States and the Soviet Union. The spread of communism in Eastern Europe threatened the democracies of the Western Hemisphere. This fear caused the US government to pass the Marshall Plan with the goal of stopping the spread of communism. These events officially marked the beginning of the Cold War. The Cold War was not a direct war, but rather a series of proxy wars in the midst of a nuclear arms race between the two biggest superpowers in the world. The intimidation, propaganda, and espionage were all tactics that were used by both sides during this period of geopolitical tension. Meanwhile, in Cuba, Fidel Castro, a communist revolutionary leader, took over the country and set up a military regime. To maintain his power, Castro allied himself with the Soviet Union for military and economic aid, and it was through this alliance the Soviets were able to sneak missiles into Cuba. For the Soviet Union, Cuba provided an ideal location for missiles due to its close proximity to the mainland US. This missile base is only 90 miles south of Florida. The missiles could be fired from Cuba and hit their target with no time for the US to prepare or respond. The Soviets saw it as a way to even out the playing field due to America's missiles in Turkey and Italy being a similar distance from them. However, to the US, the missiles were an act of aggression that would not be tolerated. On October 22nd, JFK informed the American people of the crisis, in which he took a strong stance against the Russian antagonism. This urgent transformation of Cuba into an important strategic base by the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas. Panic ensued at home after Kennedy delivered a speech, and soldiers who were currently deployed rushed to call their families in the midst of the fear of complete nuclear annihilation.
I called home and had to wait in line to get the payphone for about an hour and a half, 2 hours. I called home and I was speaking to my parents, and I was telling them, trying to calm them down a little bit. And then I asked to speak to my brother. And I told my brother, this is it. It's going to be the invasion real soon, and tell mom and dad.
To prevent any further missiles from arriving in Cuba, JFK announced a complete naval blockade of Cuba. The anger that Khrushchev felt about the blockade was expressed in his letter to Kennedy. The Soviet government considers that the violation of freedom to use international waters and international airspace is an act of aggression which pushes mankind toward the abyss of a world nuclear missile war. The United States demanded that the missiles be removed, but Cuba and the Soviet Union stated that the missiles were strictly defensive. On the 27th, a U.S. spy plane flying over Cuba was shot down by a Soviet missile. The pilot is considered the only casualty of the crisis. For the first time in history, the U.S. military had set itself to DEFCON 2, the state of readiness one step away from nuclear war.
People were scared. People were glued to the radios. They knew there was going to be a total war. This was it.
To prevent further escalation of the crisis, Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Jabrinin and Attorney General Robert Kennedy met in secret in Washington, D.C. Their heated negotiations eventually led to the agreement that the Soviets would remove all missiles from Cuba and the U.S. would remove their missiles from Turkey and Italy, and promised to never invade Cuba after the Soviets' withdrawal from Cuba. A day later, on October 28th, Khrushchev sent a message accepting the terms of agreement. President Kennedy responded by issuing a public statement by welcoming Khrushchev's compliance, which officially ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. Both the Americans and Soviets were sobered by the Cuban Missile Crisis. The following year, a direct hotline communication link was installed between Washington and Moscow to help defuse similar situations, and the superpowers signed 2 treaties related to nuclear weapons. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed that even in times of extreme stress and conflict, diplomacy can still be shown and agreements can still be reached for the good of the people. This crisis also exposed the volatility of global politics and the amount of destruction that can be caused in response to it.